Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 22nd of December. Today we're doing a frontline update primarily focusing on Novomykhailivka, Avdiivka, and Bakhmut. And then we're going to look at the shooting down of Su-34 aircraft and reports regarding the movement of F-16s into western Ukraine. Let's begin by looking at Novomykhailivka, where we've discussed the Russian advances to the south and to the east of the village and the Ukrainian defensive operations. We have this very interesting video from December 21st. It shows a point of view of Russian soldiers from two units, the 7th Special Purpose Battalion of the DPR, and then also the 155th Marine Brigade, a Russian unit that was previously engaged in combat around Pavlivka and Vuhledar. And it appears certain elements of that unit are now engaged in clearing out Novomykhailivka further to the northeast. And so in that video, what you see in this video is geolocated to this part over here. You have a mechanized assault launched by the Russian forces to the east of Novomykhailivka, and the BMP-3 on which the Russian forces were riding atop, it was actually disabled by a landmine. And the video shows how the dismounted infantry from that vehicle, they continue to advance towards the Ukrainian fortified position, specifically located on this tree line over here where you have a trench and you have the Ukrainian vanguard holding out to prevent Russian incursions into the village itself. So what ensued were close quarter firefights between the Russian and Ukrainian infantry, and what's reported by the Russian side, first of all in the video you can see some of the casualties, but what's reported by the Russian side is that there were some losses due to small arms and mortar fire, so eventually the squad withdrew with their wounded, and so in this particular case the attack was repelled. And this goes to show that even though the Russian forces are advancing on the outskirts, the Ukrainian defensive component in this region is still able to repel many of these assaults actually. And a lot of the time it does come not just from infantry-based firefights, but also from repelling certain vehicular columns. So you'll have a lot of instances of the 79th Air Assault Brigade, the Ukrainian unit defending over here, with their mobile ATGM crews targeting the columns of Russian vehicles are advancing along paths and key roads coming in from the east into the south. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also conducting localized counterattacks. On the 21st of December, the Ukrainians actually retook this part south of Novomykhailivka, including this agricultural facility. And the reason why the Ukrainians are really fighting tooth and nail for each square inch, each small piece of territory, especially this area over here south of the village, which is extremely fortified, is in order to protract the fighting for as long as possible. The reason why is in order to allow the Ukrainians to build up their forces, build up fortifications in Konstantinivka to prevent a Russian advance that would occur at a faster pace towards that village. As we talked about in previous videos, Konstantinivka is really the reason why Ukraine is really defending tooth and nail in Novomykhailivka, because by taking over Konstantinivka, the Russian forces would have unlocked a key road junction which allows the Russian forces to initiate several attack vectors, going westwards, going to the northeast, but most importantly going towards Vuhledar to the southwest along this key road. And so that's the Ukrainian rationale. They want to buy time, and now that the Ukrainians are really beginning to invest in building up defensive fortifications, it does seem like their overarching goal. Today on the 22nd, we also heard reports from the pro-Russian side, specifically Rybar, claiming that Russian forces were able to advance on the northern flank of Novomykhailivka, taking over the Zhiverinets animal farm, which is a key fortification system that the Ukrainians have been using to control the open fields in the area to the south of Marinka. So basically, I'll highlight that area in yellow for you guys, basically the fields I'm referring to, to the east of Pobieda, to the north of Novomykhailivka. And so this fortification system has really been a thorn in the back of the Russian side. And so now it's being reported that the Russian side has taken it over. There's no confirmation of that, but certainly over the past few days, the front line has shifted closer and closer to that key Ukrainian fortification. And at the same time, it is located in a higher ground, which overlooks the Ukrainian positions that are located on a valley in Novomykhailivka. You can see the valley over here, and then the high ground is more so concentrated in the fields to the north of that valley. Now moving on to Avdiivka, the Russian advances over the past few days have been reported on the northern flank, and we have some videos to back it up. So looking at the area north of Stepova, actually, we do see Russian advances along two rail lines that intersect at this point over here. And the point that I'm going to go over, there's a lot of tree lines and shrubbery in the region. In that point, which is within the blue rectangle, is still under Ukrainian control. It's one of the higher elevated areas in the region. Really, every single point on which the rail line and the parallel tree lines are located are also on rather high elevation in comparison to some of the other villages, as we're going to get to in a second. But either way, the Russian forces are advancing through high ground, taking over high ground in the fields in between the tree lines. So, this area is on rather high elevation, and also all the fields in between are in pretty high elevation. And the objective is to develop new attack vectors and to get control over some key heights. And so now some of the Russian advances along this specific rail line are backed up, first of all, by reports from the pro-Ukrainian side. So, you have Deep State Map updating their map. And there's also geolocated footage of the 31st Mechanized Brigade. So one of the Ukrainian units that was engaging in the counteroffensive now moved to the Avdiivka front. Their FPV hits a Russian dugout that was built on the northern tree line facing towards the Ukrainian positions in Novomykhailivka. That's confirmation that now the Russian forces are sending infantry to try to dig in this region to try to make it their new forward line as they try to advance even deeper into the Ukrainian positions in the region. And then further east, you have additional confirmation of Russian forces using these rail lines and tree lines to their own use, because you have videos of the 52nd Rifle Battalion, so a Ukrainian unit, their FPV hits Russian positions located under the rail line. And so again, this is not just one-sided. At the same time, the Ukrainian side is also using their drones to target the Russian infantry out in the open and in their fortified spots that they're taking over. And this is what the most recent Russian advance really amounts to in terms of the territory. And just to measure it for you guys, at most 500, 600 meters. So all of the areas within this yellow perimeter are located on rather high elevation in comparison to the other areas on the map, and especially around Ocheretine. This is an extremely high area in the region, but also the area on the rail lines where the Russian forces are located is also on pretty high elevation. And just one of the reasons why this is important is because it gives the Russians cover from the north as they try to advance around Stepove. So basically around Stepove and around Berdichi, the elevation is pretty low both for the Russian and the Ukrainian sides. But we're now hearing of movement of the Russian side, not within Stepove directly, but just to the north of it. Along this attack vector over here, you could see that it's just on the northern flank of the village. And the idea is to try to flank Stepove, to try to make the positions of the Ukrainians in and around Stepove more tenuous and eventually push them out, but not just from Stepove, but also to bypass the fighting in Stepove and begin attacks on Berdichi head-on, which is also located on a rather low valley. And at the same time, the Russian side, at least their plan, is to try to get control of these heights over here to overlook Berdichi. And Berdichi, the reason why Berdichi is so important, if you could see on my map, you could see all of these yellow and green lines. This shows how Berdichi is a key supply hub that leads into the northern flank of Avdiivka, into the northern part with the coke plant and with a lot of the fortified structures the Ukrainians have built up. So there is a significance, and cutting it off would reduce the volume of supplies and the routes that the Ukrainians have at disposal to continue to send reinforcements and equipment into that city. Now moving on to Klishchiivka, there's not much from this region, just a minor update based on a geolocated video showing the 26th Artillery Brigade, a Ukrainian unit shelling Russian infantry just to the east of Klishchiivka. This just gives us an idea of how the Russians now have activity and presence right next to the rail lines that are located to the east of the village of Klishchiivka along this line over here, as Russia is trying to put pressure not just from the northwest along height 215.7, but also to the east of the village of Klishchiivka, trying to establish a new forward line along the rail line and the parallel tree lines. So far, they've not achieved that in every single region. You could see on my map, they've had more success in the northern parts of the rail line around the train station specifically. But for now, a lot of those assaults have been repelled by artillery elements from the 26th, as we talked about, but also from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. They're also fighting in this region, targeting Russian vehicles and troop accumulations. And then something I have to correct on my map, which is not true. The Russian forces do not have control over this strip of land on the rail line. I just can't edit the polygon to change the front line to move back the positions, but just know that the Ukrainians do still have a presence in this part of the rail line, and they still have a presence even further south. And so it is a Russian objective at this current point in time to try to dislodge the Ukrainian forces from their forward positions in this area. But at the same time, there's even more importance for the Russian forces to solidify control over the heights that are overlooking Klishchiivka, because if you look at the elevation, first of all, Klishchiivka is located on a valley. So are the fields to the east of Klishchiivka, and so is the rail line. At the same time, the Ukrainian forces do have the advantage of controlling all of the heights that are located to the west of Klishchiivka. But in terms of height, 215.7 and its fortified structures, right now the Russian forces are assaulting those specifically and have taken over a large chunk of that region. Meanwhile, looking at Bohdanivka, the Russian forces have further developed their attack vector to the south of that village, as is proven by a geolocated video published by the Russian side. And I don't know why I don't have a caption for this. Essentially, in that video, what you'll see is there are Ukrainian positions located along this specific tree line, including a trench, and they get hit by Russian FPVs. And eventually, that area gets cleared, and there are Ukrainian casualties in these defensive positions. And then by the end of the video, you have Russian paratroopers in their winter gear clearing out those same areas. And so this would indicate that there was a Russian advance in this region, which if you measure it with a measuring stick, amounts to about a 500, 400 meter advance through this specific polygon over here, which I'll mark in red for you guys. And so this is what's confirmed based on the most recent footage, including Russian advances along the same rail line and a lot of the dense tree lines that are located parallel to it over here. But I am aware of claims that there was a Russian force that actually entered into the northeastern corner of Bohdanivka, like around here, and established positions in some additional tree lines located around here, which indicate the front line looks something like this, which would be a rather significant advance if proven to be true by geolocated footage. Although so far I've only seen reports of this by the pro-Russian side. I've not seen any sort of footage to back it up. So for now, I'm keeping this region a gray zone, with the Ukrainian actually defensive lines currently being located along this road over here, although even this is disputed by pro-Russian sources on some of their mapping. And at the same time, I've not yet seen any indication of the Ukrainian forces being pushed back from the northernmost outskirts of the village. Now you can see how the vector of attack for the Russian forces continues to develop along the rail line, and it's getting very close to the actual point where they reach the heights, because right now the Russian advance is still located on a valley, and so is Bohdanivka, to be fair. But the region towards which Russia is advancing to the northeast of the Kalinina suburb of Chasiv Yar, because Kalinina is located over here, the area towards which the Russian forces are advancing is on a height, this ridge that overlooks Bohdanivka, and that could be some of the rationale behind the Russian choice for their attacks. And the same thing with the northern flank of Bohdanivka. There's also a height or a ridge overlooking the valley of Bohdanivka. Although we have not seen the same level of Russian assaults in that direction, we have seen some Russian strikes, including artillery and FPV strikes on the Ukrainian defensive positions overlooking the village of Bohdanivka. Now moving on to the Siversk salient, which I would define as this semicircle-like area on the front line, which is just to the east of the city of Siversk. We've really not seen a lot of movement around here in really like a year now, or even more than that, basically. And that's due to other parts of the front line having much higher priority, and also due to the Ukrainians establishing some very powerful forward defensive positions in some of these towns and hamlets. But we do see some movement today. We do have this geolocated footage showing the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, one of the Ukrainian units that's been on the salient of Siversk for a very long time. So they are very experienced with a specific region, and their FPVs hit a group of 4 Russian soldiers that are advancing along this specific rail line, which is a common theme in today's videos. It advances along rail lines, and this gives us confirmation that the Russian forces have activity located along this rail line, sort of creating a bulge in the direction of Avdiivka, Avdiivka, but still rather far away from those positions. At the same time, this gives the Russian forces an area of, or a sort of zone of control in the heights that are located to the northeast of the valley, which is located in Vesele, which is the Ukrainian forward defensive line in this region located to the north of Yakovlivka. Despite the very difficult terrain for the Ukrainian side, they've been able to hold on to this village for over a year now, despite a lot of, not necessarily assaults head on, but a lot of pressure being put on it. So it will be interesting to see if that changes in the coming months due to the pressure coming from the northeastern flank. Now let's move on to Spirne. This is a pretty interesting part of the front line, because most of the Russian assaults on this village, which is extremely fortified, especially the westernmost part of it, have occurred directly to the east along this attack vector. But now we're seeing for the first time, I believe, maybe in a very long time, I can't recall the last time this occurred, actually a mechanized assault occurring to the south of the village, likely with the aim of flanking it, taking over control of some of the fortified areas in between Avdiivka and Spirne, these two villages over here. So what you saw was, first of all, I want to say that the front line here is not entirely accurate. The front line that would be most accurate, because I can't edit the map right now, looks something like this. So I am overestimating the Russian control just a little bit. But in any case, here we have geolocated footage which shows the 8th Battalion of the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade repelling a Russian mechanized assault. And in that video, and this is not a full video encapsulating the entire incident, but within the specific video, you could see that there was artillery which hit directly the BMP-2 on which some of the Russian infantry was being transported to likely overrun some of the Ukrainian defensive positions located around here. And then at the same time, there's video of Russian T-64 being hit by an FPV drone. And so there were 2 vehicle losses in that specific video, and then 2 other vehicles that were documented as abandoned. And then there was additional footage that was released just today showing the capturing of 6 Russian POWs in an assault on this area south of Spirne along this key road. So once there was several losses to vehicles, you had some of the infantry dismount in the gray zone between the Russian and Ukrainian lines alike, and at that point the Ukrainian infantry was able to capture some of those troops alive and take them as POWs. So for now, this region, which was really untested in terms of its defensive capabilities, was able to stand firm and prevent any sort of Russian advances. But as I said before, this part of the front line is a much lower priority for both sides. On the 22nd of December, the Ukrainian General Staff reported the downing of 3 Russian Su-34s. Russian channels confirmed the loss of aircraft, with the fighter bomber Telegram channel affiliated with the Russian Air Force at first confirming the loss of at least 1 aircraft and then saying that the Russian authorities had found all the pilots whose planes were shot down either dead or alive, which is implying that more than 1 aircraft was shot down in that incident. And here's an image that I believe to be authentic, as it was shared by both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, showing a Russian MiA helicopter, and it's being alleged that it's evacuating the pilots, either dead or alive. That's not known, at one of the crash sites of the Su-34 plane. So since the beginning of the war, at least 21 Su-34s have been visually confirmed as destroyed, and now it could potentially be at 24. So before the war, it was estimated the Russians had about 150 Su-34s. And now, since the beginning of the war, every half a year or so, the Russian United Aircraft Corporation, this company, they deliver a batch of fighter bombers to the Russian Air Force. And each batch is estimated to have between 2 to 4 Su-34M. What's really interesting is that in recent weeks, we talked about how the Russians have been using Su-34 bombers to drop in batches of 2 Fab 500s and Fab 1500s about 50 kilometers away from the front line. So let's take out a measuring stick to get an idea of the scale of where they're being dropped from. And then from there, the Fabs, they have these UMPK gliding guidance kits, which hit the Ukrainian positions on the Krinky bridgehead, on staging points on the Ukrainian side of the river, and even deeper on the rear. And that's caused a lot of damage to the Ukrainian Marines and to the Ukrainian personnel on the Kherson front in general, as we've really seen dozens of such strikes being reported on a daily basis. A very important issue that's been raised that I talked about in my previous video, and it's been raised by a lot of Ukrainian soldiers fighting in this region, is a lack of air defense coverage against the Su-34s that are launching these bombs from 50 kilometers away from the front line. So that's way too far for the range of some of the shorter or medium range air defense systems that are being operated in this region. And so it seems like that concern has been taken seriously, and the Ukrainian command has heeded to the concerns of the Ukrainian forces in this region. So I say this because it appears the Ukrainians actually deployed an MIM 104 Patriot battery, and this perhaps may be the battery that the Ukrainians received from Germany's stockpile last week, which, as far as we know, is the 3rd Patriot battery that the Ukrainians have received in aid. So if it's true that a Patriot battery was deployed to this area, that could be significant in the sense that it has a range of about 160 kilometers in this instance. And of course, it's not going to be placed right on the front line. but let's say it's placed 30, 40 kilometers away from the front line. That's coverage of about 120 kilometers deep into Russian territory. And so you could see how that covers all of the area around Kherson, and that also includes the 50-kilometer area where you'd have the FABs being released from, and also going into areas like Crimea. And so in that regard, it could reduce the frequency and the volume of the FAB strikes by the Russian side. And it will also be extremely interesting to see how the Russians adapt to the moving of the longer range air defense systems into this region. Meanwhile, speaking about aid shipments, pro-Russian source Rybar claims that 12 combat and 3 training F-16s have already been transferred into Ukrainian territory in December. And there are training flights being conducted in the airspace of Romania and Western Ukraine, with these F-16s actually landing in airfields within Ukraine, including in Ivano-Frankivsk and Usarad, which are both cities in Western Ukraine, but within Ukraine nonetheless. And at the same time, Rybar reports that parts of the aircraft are being stored in cities such as Dnipro, in Kryvyi Rih, and then further to the west in the city of Starokostiantiniv. Although we have heard statements from European officials throughout the summer and fall of 2023 about hopes of delivering these F-16s to Ukraine by the end of the year, this report by Rybar is still not confirmed to my knowledge by any sort of external source. So what I'm about to say is also not confirmed, but Rybar also claims that it's being planned by mid-spring of 2024 that another F-16 squadron will be delivered to Ukraine itself. And so that's all the news that we have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.